Right, welcome to the 24-25 NCAA tournament predictions from Drew Hill. Today I'm going to look at a preseason bracket and also discuss some of the awards, some things I'm looking for in the championship favorites for this year. Before I start by actually revealing the bracket, I want to look at some of the common factors that some of the recent champions have had, because it's hard enough to pick a champion when you actually have the bracket and you see it, much less to pick a champion before the season even begins. And when you look at rankings, preseason rankings to me are a bit confusing because people don't always specify what they mean. For example, when you look at like the top 25, when they rank them, 1 through 4, does that mean that they believe that's a Final Four team or that that's going to be a 1 seed in the tournament? You could look at the regular season ranking, which would be a top 4 team, but the 1 seeds don't all go to the Final Four. It's only happened once in the history of the NCAA tournament. When I do these, sometimes you might see a team that you think might be ranked a little higher. You might have disagreements with that. But just remember that not every team that's ranked high goes as far in the tournament. A lot of things can happen over the course of the season that would cause a team to be ranked lower than you would think they should be. In recent years, basically since the COVID tournament got canceled and we've had 4 champions since then, I've noticed kind of an interesting trend with all those teams is that in this age of portal madness and guys changing teams all the time, you got rebuilt teams that make the tournament. One thing has stayed the same, and that is usually you have to have multiple returning players, preferably some veterans, who've been there for a few years, to win a championship. With Baylor, deep guard room with multiple returning players. Same with Kansas and even UConn. After losing quite a bit from the year before, still brought back key players like Tristan Newton, Caravan, Klingon, and some of the other players they brought back. But also interesting is that all 4 of those teams had at least one impactful transfer guard that played a key role. For Baylor, Adam Flagler was their sixth man. Kansas had Remy Martin as the sixth man, and then UConn had Tristan Newton, and then when he returned, brought in Cam Spencer for their second championship run. So when I'm looking at some of the teams this year, I'm looking for teams that are returning quite a bit. Sometimes a team might have the most talented group, and you say, oh, well, you don't. It's like the one and done era. You don't really need to return everyone to win a championship, but that cohesiveness really helps. Even with the runner up last year, we saw the same thing. Purdue brought back almost like entirely their own roster, but then added a key transfer guard in Lance Jones. So I looked for teams that were returning quite a bit, but also did look at some teams that maybe did have a transfer guard, bring in a veteran presence from outside, and maybe some like UConn had freshmen on each of those championship teams. So I'm not saying you can't. It has to be every player is a returning senior, but you have to have at least a few of those veteran presence, or a few of those veterans as a presence for your team. One team I think that's a little bit overrated this year in terms of their championship equity is Kansas, because they do fit in some of those criteria. They're bringing back 3 key starters in KJ Adams, Hunter Dickinson, and DeJuan Harris. They're bringing in some multiple transfer guards, including AJ Storr, but I don't see as much returning depth. And to be honest, it feels like they're running back the same team as last year, but with AJ Storr in for Kevin McCullough. I think they are a little bit deeper, but I don't know if I would put Kansas as the number 1 team, especially since they disappointed last year under similar circumstances. So for them to be fighting with Alabama for the number 1 spot, I think Alabama is a fine team to put as your preseason number 1. We've also seen in recent years that the preseason number 1 or number 2 team haven't actually gone on to win the championship. Usually they're somewhere in that 3 to 12 range in the preseason when they win it. Even UConn 2 years ago when they won was near the back half of the top 25 in most of the preseason rankings when they went on to win it. So I personally think Alabama is a better pick if you're going to pick one of those 2, but I don't necessarily think Alabama's a surefire thing anyway. Obviously, nobody is. Anybody can lose in the NCAA tournament on any given day. That's what makes it so exciting. So we're going to start out by revealing the bracket, kind of like they do with the selection committee, one region at a time. So starting in the top left, in the East region, for our number 1 overall seed, I've got Duke. And a lot of people are going to be mad about that. They don't have a lot of returning players. They're built a lot on their freshmen. It's all freshman hype. It's all Cooper Flag hype. And I do think Cooper Flag could be the most impactful freshman since Zion Williamson. So I do have him actually as my preseason Naismith Player of the Year, leading Duke to the overall 1 seed. Is that because I think Duke has a better chance of winning the championship than any other team? Not necessarily. Until last year, an overall 1 seed had not won the tournament since Louisville in 2013. The overall 1 seed doesn't guarantee a win, but I think Duke does have an advantage of playing in an easier power conference. You look at the Big 12 and the SEC, how deep they are. The Big 10 doesn't have quite the ceiling as those two conferences does, but it does have a lot, it has the depth as well. Where the ACC, I mean, beyond Duke and North Carolina, it's hard to find a surefire NCAA tournament team. So I think Duke could, potentially beat up on an easier schedule. It also provides more opportunities for losses, so that could drag down their seeding a little bit. But I think the hype will definitely help, similar to when Duke had Zion and they got the overall 1 seed. So I've got Duke as the 1, and their 16 seed is Merrimack. Feels like they've been knocking on the door for a while. Moved to a new conference this year, so I have them breaking through in their first year in the new conference and getting to the NCAA tournament as the 16 seed to face Cougar Flag and Duke. Our 8 and 9, continuing down the bracket, we've got Michigan State versus VCU. So VCU I have as the lead team out of the A10, and then Michigan State making the tournament for another consecutive year. There are only 3 teams that have made every tournament since the 90s or before, and that's Kansas, Gonzaga, and Michigan State, and I think that streak continues for all 3. We'll get to the other 2 later. Our 5 seed, I have Ole Miss taking a big step forward after narrowly missing the tournament in Chris Beard's first year, playing number 12 Princeton. And the last couple of years, the Ivies kind of come back and pulled a few upsets. Obviously, the Ivy League's no stranger to upsets, but there was kind of a gap between, some of their upsets from like 2012, 2016 era until a couple years ago with Princeton beating Arizona and going to the Sweet 16. So we'll see if Princeton can pull the upset here. And then the other matchup here in the top half of the East Regional, we got Tennessee as the 4. So slight step back after losing Dalton Connect, but still going to stay up there with the defense. And then number 13, Vermont, pretty much an automatic pick to at least win the regular season and usually the auto bid from the America East. Then for our 6-11 matchup, we've got Florida versus Notre Dame. So this might be a bit of a surprise, but Notre Dame returned almost their entire roster, had some really good freshmen. And sometimes, you can't always bank on young teams just taking that leap forward. Sometimes there's a sophomore slump. Sometimes, progression isn't gradual. Sometimes, they can put up great stats but not actually produce winning basketball. But I think Notre Dame takes a step forward under Shrewsbury's second year. 314 here, we've got Baylor. Baylor's a pretty hype team, another top 10 Big 12 team, and they're playing number 14, Middle Tennessee State. So Middle Tennessee returning from Conference USA after missing for a few years. See if they can produce some magic. Our 7-10, I've got Ohio State as a 7. Jake Diebler auditioned well, got to keep the job, and there is some quiet hype around Ohio State in a Big 10 without an obvious favorite. Got them as a 7, playing number 10, Oklahoma State. Now, this is definitely an out there type of pick, but the last 2 years, the Big 12 team who finished in last place the year previous made the tournament the following year. Actually, I think that's 3 years now in a row that that's happened. And so Oklahoma State got a new coach this year who's made actually 3 straight tournaments. He's not going to be starting out with much. Bryce Thompson's really the only returner. He's a key player, though. Brought in a good transfer class. Devontae Davis from Arkansas, who's played some good tournament basketball for Arkansas, joins the party. So I think Oklahoma State bounces back and is a surprise entrant into the tournament out of a loaded Big 12 this year. And then number 2, we've got the two-time defending champion UConn Huskies playing Lipscomb out of the ASUN. So that is our East Regional. Now, if we go over to the top right hand of our bracket, so this is going to be the second overall 1 seed, and this will be the South Regional. Our number 1 here is Alabama. So I do have Alabama finishing the season as one of the top 4 seeded teams, winning the SEC. So there are the number 2 overall 1 seed, and they'll be playing the winner of a first 4 matchup between Central Connecticut and Norfolk State. So Norfolk out of the MEAC and Central Connecticut out of the NEC. For our 8-9 there, we've got Kansas State bouncing back as the 8. They're going to be relying on a lot of transfers. And then they're playing the 9 seed UAB, top team out of the American Athletic Conference. Our 5 seed here, San Diego State. There is some definite questions about the team after losing a lot of their key players, but they have been one of the most consistent programs in America the last few years. So I've got them back as a 5. Defense can definitely help make you a more consistent program, and San Diego State plays really good defense. And they'll be playing a 12 seed McNeese. So McNeese gets a 12 again this year, and honestly could be even better than last year when they won 30 games. So looking at a San Diego State McNeese game. And then the 4-13 here, we've got Purdue playing Towson. Towson's been knocking on the door the last couple of years out of the Colonial Athletic Association, but I think this is the year they break through and get to play Purdue in the first round, who is missing Zach Edey. So Purdue is at my pick for the Big Ten championship after winning the last couple of years. They lose Zach Edey and Lance Jones; those are huge losses, but everyone else in the Big Ten lost quite a bit, and I don't see an obvious favorite for the Big Ten championship. So we'll go with the most consistent proven team who's returning quite a few key players, although not the best of those key players. For our 6-11, I've got Texas A&M, and this might feel a little bit low considering all that they're returning, but they have tended to stub their toes in the non-conference last couple years. So this actually might end up being a little bit high, but I think they'll be among the best teams in the SEC. It just might be another slow start that hurts their seeding. So I've got them as the 6th seed, and they get the winner of another first four matchup between Providence and BYU. And I'll be honest, I almost put Wisconsin in instead of Providence. So Providence is my last team in. So BYU, I think, takes a slight step back with a lot of guys leaving. There's some hype around the new coach and some of the players, including their freshman, Igor Dinam. But I do think they narrowly sneak into the tournament. There's a lot of Big 12 teams. There's going to be a lot of SEC teams, quite a few Big 10 teams as well. Providence gets in as an extra Big East team. We have that for our first four matchup to play Texas A&M. Then the 3-14 here, we've got Marquette taking a slight step back, but not too far with Cam Jones leading the way. And then the 14 seed UC Irvine out of the Big West. And then for our 7-10, perennial bubble team who's been just on the wrong side the last couple of years, Wake Forest. And they get number 10 seed Rutgers, led by a couple star freshmen of their own. And then for our 2-15, we've got Iowa State versus High Point. So High Point comes out of the Big South, Iowa State 2 seed out of the Big 12. So continuing down the right side of the bracket, we move on to the West region. So this is the third 1 seed. And here we've got Gonzaga. Last year they were a bubble team until a big run got them all the way up to the 5 seed, where they made the Sweet 16 for I think the 9th consecutive year. So Gonzaga making the Sweet 16 is the floor, and that's a good place to be. Gonzaga is the 1 in the West in this prediction, and they get for their 16 seed Northern Arizona. Big Skies tend to be upset prone the last couple of years in their conference tournament, so I think Northern Arizona gets to the top this year. In our 8-9, another really overrated team, in my opinion, is Indiana. Indiana has a great class of transfers, and I'm not going to deny that. Omar Ballo is a really good player. Some of the other transfers they brought in are also good. But when you try to put together a whole team of newcomers, even when they're really talented, sometimes they don't gel. Sometimes they're putting up stats at their school because they got the right fit or the right role, and they struggle, at a new school or with new opportunity. And so sometimes it doesn't always work out. And personally, I don't think Indiana is as good. I think they get kind of a big hype bump because of production in like the 70s. You see that in football quite a bit with, schools like Texas or Miami or Nebraska doing fairly good this year, but most years tend to get overhyped because of the name brand. Same as like the Dallas Cowboys or the Lakers, just a star city or star team with, star players who doesn't perform as good as expected. I think Indiana gets a little bit of that as well. So I've got them as the 8 seed, so still making the tournament, but not as high as some people are putting them as like a 4 seed or a 5 seed. Winning the Big Ten, I'm not quite as high on them there. They did get a 4 seed just a couple years ago, but that was with Trace Jackson Davis returning for a 5th year and basically carrying the team on his back like Superman. I don't know if there's that level of superstar in this class of transfers or among the returners. And they also might struggle to shoot. They brought in one shooter, Luke Goody from Illinois, but I don't know if they're going to be able to nail threes at an accurate rate with any of the other players, which could hurt them. For the 9 seed, we've got Clemson. So Clemson gets back in after making the Elite 8 last year. For our 5-12, we've got Arkansas versus Bradley. So Bradley out of the Missouri Valley finally breaks through again after making tournament a few years ago. And then Arkansas gets a 5 in John Calipari's first year. Our 4-13, we've got Arizona, Ohio. So Ohio out of the MAC, Arizona, the first year in the Big 12, takes a slight step back seeding-wise, just with the difficulty of the conference, but stays among the top. And then our 6-11, we've got Cincinnati versus Grand Canyon. I've got them building on last year's season and moving up to an 11 seed from a 12 seed to play 6 seed Cincinnati again out of the Big 12. For our 3-14, we've got Creighton playing Northern Kentucky out of the Horizon. And then for our 7-10, Xavier playing Memphis. So Memphis bounces back, gets back into the tournament under Penny Hardaway as our second American athletic team. And then for our 2 seed, we do finally find Kansas. So I think they do improve a little bit on last year. And then their 15 seed, they get to play a South Dakota State. Losing a lot, but definitely a really consistent program. And then finally, final region. Well, if you're a Houston fan, obviously you knew I wasn't going to leave them out of the tournament. They're in as the final 1 seed in the Midwest. Top seeded team out of the Big 12, whether they actually won the Big 12 regular season or just the conference tournament, we'll wait and see, but I have them as the 1 seed here. And for their 16, they get the winner of Texas Southern or Little Rock. Then for our 8 and 9, we've got Boise State back in the tournament again. See if they can get their first tournament win, but they get to play Illinois. This is another team I think is slightly overranked. Not that I doubt anything that Brad Underwood has done as a coach. He has done really well, but people are considering them like almost taking a step forward or, only falling back to like a 4 or 5 seed. And they're basically replacing their entire team, not just like the stars like Coleman Hawkins who transferred to Kansas State and Terrence Shannon, which would be enough to replace. But like I said, Luke Goody, some of the other role players have also left. And even if the freshmen are good, they could definitely overperform just due to the low ceiling of the top Big Ten teams. But I don't think they get much higher than maybe the 7, maybe the 6 to 9 range. For a 5 seed, another Big Ten school, UCLA, gets St. Louis, who I have as the A10's surprise tournament winner this year. Last year is Duquesne, and they got to win a game. We'll see if St. Louis can do that against Mick Cronin and UCLA. For our 4-13, we've got Rick Pitino's St. John's playing Chattanooga. Then our 6-11, St. Mary's gets the winner of Kentucky and Northwestern. And I think Kentucky is another team that's getting a name brand bump. They are bringing in a lot of veteran transfers, and I think that's great. But even when you have veteran transfers, sometimes it takes a while for the pieces to fit together. And sometimes, if you got guys who are veterans at smaller schools, they don't always live up to the spotlight. Other ones do. Tyson Walker was like a superstar at Michigan State last year. But, you also have examples like Arkansas, who was able to, mix the transfer portal together the last few years until last year, where it looked like they had another 5-guy, all great player transfer class, and they end up having a losing record. And that was with Eric Musselman, who's been a really good coach. So it doesn't always work out. So I think Kentucky does sneak into the tournament here, but I have them as an 11 seed playing Northwestern, who's coming off the loss of Boo Buie. So this might be a little bit high for them, but feels like they could take the next step as a program. Made the tournament in back-to-back years, and they still, every year they've made the tournament, have at least won one game. So see if that continues here. Their 3-14 pair is Auburn facing Troy out of the Sun Belt. For our 7-10, we've got Texas Tech playing Mississippi State. And then finally, North Carolina is our final 2 seed playing Colgate. So some notable teams that got left out. As I mentioned, I almost put Wisconsin in just based on their track record, but they lost a lot. They are still bringing back some key guys like Stephen Kroll, but a lot lost there. Virginia, the roster doesn't look as talented, but the defense can usually carry them. However, they barely made the tournament last year. A lot of people didn't think they should. I personally thought that they did deserve a spot, even though they ended up getting blown out in an ugly way in the tournament. The reason I left them out really wasn't so much about their specific players, but more because their coach, Tony Bennett, retired just before the season. And since it's so late in the process, you could argue that, the defense is still going to be good. They should still be among the top in the ACC. But an ACC that outside the top 2 looks increasingly bubbly, that might not be enough to get them back to the tournament. Other ones, Michigan, first year Dusty May might be just short of the tournament. Same with some of the other Big Ten teams. And I feel like there probably will be a couple extra Big Ten teams just because out of 18, you're going to beat up on each other enough where you're going to have teams with good records and enough somewhat quality wins to get spots. But I mostly packed on the SEC and the Big 12 teams, which those might not work out because usually, even if you have a great conference and it's really deep and a big conference, they're going to beat up on each other somewhat and you're going to lose some teams there. The Big Ten managed to send 10 out of a 14-team conference a couple years ago, so I think Big 12, the SEC could potentially do that this year. So let's start looking at who's going to win some of these games. So starting in the first 4, for our South representative for the 16 seed, we've got Central Connecticut versus Norfolk State. We've got Norfolk getting back to the tournament after missing the last 2 years and winning their first game against Central Connecticut to get to face Alabama. For our other 16 seed in the Midwest, we got Texas Southern Little Rock. Texas Southern is just a cheat code when it comes to winning conference tournaments. They didn't do it last year. Last year was Grambling State, but I have them back in this year, but I have Little Rock winning that game. Then for our 11s in the South, we've got Providence BYU. I've got BYU knocking off Providence to advance to face Texas A&M. And then Kentucky versus Northwestern. I have Northwestern knocking off Kentucky in the first 4 to get to face St. Mary's. Then we turn to the East, where I've got Duke over Merrimack, got Michigan State over VCU, so we'll have a Duke-Michigan State game in the second round. Ole Miss Princeton, I do have the Ivy winning for a 3rd straight year as Princeton upsets Ole Miss in a 5-12 to advance to play Tennessee, who gets by Vermont. I have Florida over Notre Dame to play Baylor, who beat Middle Tennessee. And then at the bottom, we've got Ohio State, Oklahoma State. I got Ohio State winning that one in the Battle of the OSUs. And then UConn taking down Lipscomb for their 13th consecutive NCAA tournament win. Moving on to the South, I've got Alabama over Norfolk. UAB knocks off Kansas State to get, so we're gonna have an Alabama battle between Bama and Alabama Birmingham. For our 5-12, I've got McNeese losing for the second straight year as a popular upset pick, losing to San Diego State, the 5 seed, and then Purdue over Towson. Then I got A&M beating BYU to play Marquette. Wake Forest beats Rutgers to play Iowa State, who beats High Point. There's a little bit of intrigue with this Wake Forest-Iowa State game. Omaha Blue, really hyped prospect. Last year didn't live up to expectations in his first year. Transfers from Iowa State to Wake Forest, but also the key star for Wake Forest is Hunter Salas, who is a former Gonzaga recruit who was actually recruited pretty heavily by Iowa State before he went to Gonzaga. So some intrigue there. In the West, we've got Gonzaga winning over Northern Arizona to play Clemson, who beats Indiana. Arkansas beats Bradley under John Calipari to play Ohio. So we've got our 4-13 upset with Ohio knocking off Arizona. It's Arizona's 4th consecutive tournament where they get no farther than the Sweet 16, and 2 out of the last 4 they've lost in the first round if this were to happen. And then Cincinnati loses to Grand Canyon, so another upset here as Grand Canyon moves on to play Creighton, who beats Northern Kentucky. And then I have Memphis winning over Xavier to play Kansas. I was almost tempted to pick an upset here. The last few years, the biggest upset in the tournament has come from a conference that hasn't really been a huge factor in tournament upsets for several years. So last year, I actually thought it might be out of the Big Sky, but ended up being Oakland out of the Horizon League, which hadn't won a tournament game in a few years. And, year before that, we had Farley Dickinson out of the NEC, which I think had never, or maybe only had once before, won a first round NCAA tournament game. The Ivy hadn't won for a few years when Princeton went to the Sweet 16 the year before that. Oral Roberts out of the Summit. Summit hadn't done a lot when they dominated. You had St. Peter's. So it's kind of been that conference that you wouldn't expect that does win the games. So Summit, though, did just have Oral Roberts a couple years ago, so that's part of the reason why I didn't pick. And also Kansas, they came really close to getting upset last year by Samford, but the last few years under Bill Self, they've been fairly consistent, at least winning in the first round. So I do have Kansas moving on. And then finally, in the Midwest, we've got Houston beating Little Rock. I've got Illinois taking down Boise State, so Boise State still doesn't get that first round tournament win. Got St. Louis in a 5-12 upset over UCLA, and they get to play St. John's, who beats Chattanooga. Northwestern once again moves on to the second round as they win their second straight, beating St. Mary's to get to play Troy. So here's my big upset. Auburn actually kind of fits that championship profile that I mentioned, but I do think they have tended to underperform in the NCAA tournament since their Final Four appearance in 2019. So I think they lose this year. In our 7-10, I've got Mississippi State taking down Texas Tech. So the 10 over the 7 to get to play North Carolina, who beats Colgate, who's been a really consistent program as well, but struggled to actually take that next step and win that big tournament game. So North Carolina advances. Moving back up to the East, I've got Duke moving past Michigan State to play Tennessee, who moves past Princeton and denies the Ivy their second Sweet 16 in 3 years. And then at the bottom, I've got Florida knocking off Baylor in the second round again. Baylor fits in a lot of ways, but I think the defense might take an even farther step back, and that's kind of been their downfall the last few years. They're kind of on the wrong trend since their championship, and I think that continues as they get taken down by Florida in the second round. And Florida's opponent will be UConn, who dominates Ohio State as they win their 14th consecutive NCAA tournament game. Then, in the South, another major upset as UAB wins the Battle of Alabamas. So last year's Final Four team, Alabama, preseason number 1 or 2 in pretty much every major polar prediction, falls to UAB. This would be definitely a shock, and honestly, just feels like something that would happen just because it's Alabama versus UAB, like two schools from the same state. And UAB gets to play Purdue, who takes down San Diego State. I've got Texas A&M over Marquette to move on to the Sweet 16 to play Iowa State, who overcomes Hunter Salas, Omaha Blue, and Wake Forest to advance. Then in the West, Gonzaga gets to their required Sweet 16 to play Arkansas. So John Calipari finally gets past the first weekend for the first time, and it feels like a while, but not with Kentucky, with Arkansas. I have Grand Canyon going to the Sweet 16 for the first time as they upset Creighton in the second round for their second consecutive upset. They will play Kansas, who beats Memphis. Moving back up to the East, we get the much hyped and anticipated Cooper Flag versus the unstoppable UConn matchup as Tennessee and Florida both fall. So, will Cooper Flag, the freshman face of the league who won Player of the Year, be able to stop UConn, who has now won 15 consecutive NCAA tournament games? Guess we'll see when it comes back around. Oh, I forgot to mention in the Midwest, I have Houston moving past Illinois, St. John's moving past St. Louis, Northwestern moving past Troy to get to the Sweet 16 for the first time in program history to play Mississippi State, who upsets North Carolina to advance to the Sweet 16. Okay, so as I mentioned, Duke, UConn. In the South, UAB continues their miracle run as they knock off Purdue to advance to the Elite Eight, where they will play Iowa State, who beats Texas A&M. Iowa State does fit the role of bringing back a lot of key players, having strong guard play, which tends to win in the NCAA tournament. And they did bring in mostly transfers to the front court, but they brought in Nate Heisey for a guard transfer. So Iowa State, especially if the bracket does tend to favor them with avoiding Marquette in the Sweet 16, they could make a run, and then they get UAB in the Elite Eight. So wouldn't that be crazy? And then Gonzaga moves past John Calipari in Arkansas to play Kansas. So I do have Kansas in the Elite Eight. So if you thought I was just being a Kansas hater, okay, I do have them still in the Elite Eight. We'll see if they get to the Final Four. And then in the Midwest, St. John's upsets Houston as Houston loses in the Sweet 16 for, I think it's the third or fourth consecutive year. So Rick Pitino gets St. John's to the Elite Eight to play Mississippi State, who continues, I don't know how many years it's been, but it's a pretty long streak of having at least one double-digit seed in the Elite Eight. So Mississippi State takes down Northwestern, which is not an upset, even though it's a 10 seed in the Sweet 16 because it's a 10 over an 11. So definitely some craziness in this bracket, but we do have two more chalky brackets. One of them is the top where Duke plays UConn, and I don't think this one is the 20-point blowouts we were used to seeing from UConn, but I do have UConn taking down Duke. Because ironically, despite the fact that it's so hard to win a title, and especially back-to-back titles or back-to-back-to-back titles, UConn does fit that role of having some returning players. They did bring back Caravan, who's really huge for them. They brought in a transfer guard in Aiden Mahaney. They have a star freshman. Another key thing to winning NCAA champion is to have some NBA talent on the roster, and Liam McNeely is supposed to be a first-round pick. So, UConn can't really rule them out. So I have them in the Final Four as they win their 16th consecutive NCAA tournament game. Am I going to go all chalk here and put UConn in the championship, winning their third straight, or will somebody stop them? The suspense mounts. One team that it might be a bit of a surprise to be in the Final Four, and maybe it's just me being buoyed by their good football play as of now. Iowa State takes down UAB. Just get ready. If UAB makes a run like this, get ready to know the name Yaxel Lendeberg, star big man, who's going to be pretty key for them. They're a good rebounding team, and I think they'll rediscover their three-point shooting touch. So this is definitely a dark horse, and this is, Elite Eight might be a bit bold, but it's preseason. Hot takes abound, and nobody remembers at the end of the season, right? So we've got two of our Final Four teams. Gonzaga, Kansas for the second straight year, and once again, Gonzaga wins. So Gonzaga joins Iowa State and UConn in the Final Four. The thing that concerns me with Iowa State, besides just being the fan of the team and you're like, oh, no, if they get hyped, they're not going to do as well, is Iowa State's been really good defensively, but they've tended to struggle offensively. And to win the championship, you have to be a really balanced team. Gonzaga, on the other hand, has been really good offensively, and I think that continues, but I fear that they could struggle defensively after losing Anton Watson, which is really their only key loss, but is a big loss as he's a do-it-all type of player. But I do still have both of them in the Final Four. And the other team is Mississippi State, so we get a 10 seed in the Final Four. This is also a bit shocking considering that they've not gotten past their first game in the NCAA tournament the last 2 years. But Josh Hubbard was really good as a freshman, and unless he goes through a sophomore slump, which is possible, the NCAA tournament is full of surprise teams. Like nobody's picking NC State before last year either. So Mississippi State and UAB are my big Cinderella picks for this year. So we've got Mississippi State taking down St. John's, denying Rick Pitino a Final Four. But unfortunately, Mississippi State's run comes to an end against the mighty UConn as UConn wins their 17th consecutive NCAA tournament game. And unfortunately, as an Iowa State fan, I'm not quite bold enough to put them in the championship. So I have Gonzaga knocking off Iowa State. Now we have the winner of 17 consecutive NCAA tournament games versus the team with the longest streak of Sweet 16s, who's knocked on the door of the championship but lost in the national championship twice in the last 10 years. And I think this is the year, and this might be the only time you ever hear me pick Gonzaga to win the NCAA tournament championship. Actually, I might have picked them when they were the preseason #1 with Holmgren. I don't remember for sure, but I think this could finally be the year. Generally, I kind of tend to shy away from the more offensive focused teams who don't have as good a defense. Part of the reason why I'm not picking Alabama, even though their defense has kind of been off and on. So sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not. But they are bringing back a lot of key players. They have a strong point guard to help control it. They have a good post game. They brought in some key transfer guards. But I don't think UConn wins this year, but it is hard to pick against them. Like they've done a lot. They've proven that they could win a third championship, but just the odds of that are so unlikely. And I feel like they're going to get picked the most. That would be really interesting. If you had Duke as the overall 1 and UConn as a 2, who would actually get picked in more brackets? I feel like a lot of people would pick UConn because they're the defending champs, but then a lot of people also tend to pick the overall 1 seed, even though, as I mentioned, picking the overall 1 seed is not always a reliable pick either. So that'll be interesting. Somebody just needs to stop UConn. That's the big goal for this year. Somebody beat UConn, knock them out of the NCAA tournament, preferably Iowa State. If Iowa State wins it all, that would be great. But you've been watching the 24-25 preseason NCAA tournament predictions. So let me know below if you agreed, disagreed with some of them, or who you would have winning the championship as of now. Thanks for listening, and hope you enjoyed it. And that's all.